The State Department has released what you might call a diplomacy strategy for the digital world. It seeks what officials call digital solidarity with other countries, and it even has a 4-part action plan. We get the rundown now from the senior advisor to the State Department's Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy, Adam Siegel. Mr. Siegel, good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, what's going on here? I mean, don't we already have solidarity with those nations that we're going to have it with anyway? I mean, the Western European nations, they've got even more stringent privacy and so forth policies than we do.
It's true. We have a lot of close partners and allies in the digital and cyber space. But even with those allies, we have some differences on how we should govern things like privacy and access to data. And so the call for digital solidarity is both to try to align interests closer with the people we're working with, but in some cases, even more importantly, to talk about the types of aid and supports that we can provide to other countries that might be on the fence or are not as closely aligned with how the U.S. views cyberspace should be governed.
Well, give us an example of that type of nation who might be on the fence. I mean, you're not going to get, Russia to join this one, but what are some of the nations that are typical of this?
Yeah, I think we're thinking a lot of the big, what we would call the global south. So, Brazil, India, Indonesia, those types of countries that have incredibly large internet digital populations, agree with us on some things and disagree with us on others.
But generally where they still elect their leaders, more or less, and those leaders stay until the end of their terms, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big part of it. But again, the digital solidarity, we don't think of it as an alliance or even democracies versus authoritarian states. Clearly, rights respecting technologies are important and essential to how we think about this. But there are going to be, standards about trusted technology and other spaces where we think we're going to be able to work closely with some countries that, politically may be backsliding or not as open as we hope they would be.
And is this something any of them have come to the United States seeking, or are we trying to see if they'll come to this policy?
I think it's early on digital solidarity, but they have certainly come to us looking for assistance and support across a range of issues, workforce development, cloud and data centers, subsea cables, a whole range of things. And so we see those as kind of opening the door to building a broader digital solidarity.
And before we get to the details that are in this digital policy, what about Commerce and Defense Department? They all must be aware of this and maybe even had some input, I imagine.
They did. This is the international strategy, and so the interagency played a large part. And of course, we cooperate closely with Commerce around issues like how we deal with digital trade and data localization and DoD around a whole range of issues on cyber capacity building, as well as how do we counter malicious actors in this space.
All right, and the digital solidarity policy or strategy, I guess it's a little of both, laid out 3 basic principles. Maybe review those briefly for us.
The principles, the first one is that this is we're offering an affirmative vision, right? So we want to describe the benefits and positive things we think come from a rights-respecting view of digital space. So the strategy spends a lot of time talking about the countries that you mentioned, Russia and China, North Korea, Iran, and the things that they do in cyberspace that threaten it. But we don't want this to be just to counter those countries. We want to convince other countries that we actually have a view of what the positive things could be. Second is really baking cybersecurity into everything that happens. And so especially for developing countries, it's really important to include cybersecurity as they build out their networks, not to try to paste it on after it's all been built. And third, it's been about 10 years since the U.S. issued this type of international strategy publicly. And the last time we did this, was really focused on internet technologies. And now we are taking a tech stack approach. There's a whole range of digital ecosystem that's really important to the U.S. and U.S. interest, and that goes from subsea cables all the way up to satellite telecoms. And so we're taking a digital ecosystem approach.
We're speaking with Adam Siegel. He's senior advisor to the Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy at the State Department. And then there are 4 basic actions that state wants to take pursuant to this new solidarity movement, let's call it. Just review those for us.
Yeah, the first one is building a secure, open, interoperable, inclusive digital ecosystems that focuses on some of those technologies I mentioned before, 5G, subsea cables, data centers, satellite communications in particular. The second is aligning interests on how we govern digital and data spaces. So trying to narrow the space between European partners, trying to push back against some of the regulations that they're doing, but also focusing on some of the new critical and emerging technologies, artificial intelligence in particular. The third is countering malicious behavior in cyberspace. So looking at how the State Department is developing and supporting implementation of norms of behavior at the UN, but also attributing attacks and building coalitions. And the third is cyber and digital capacity building. So helping countries build their own workforces or respond to cyber incidents, and in particular highlights a new cyber and digital related technology fund that Congress granted the Bureau and how we're going to spend that money.
And that last point, building that capacity physically, I guess in some nations just need infrastructure. That sounds like a job for USAID.
It is. So USAID, certainly plays a role in that, but also some of this has to do, for example, lessons learned from Albania, Ukraine, and Costa Rica, where we discovered that a lot of these countries need incident response, right? They need help both rebuilding their networks after attacks, but also expelling the attacker. So CDP, FBI, Cyber Command, all of those also play a role there.
And what kinds of resources is state putting into carrying this out? Because you've got a diplomatic mission function with all the diplomats and their staffs at the 200 and some places around the world. But is there work or people dedicated to carrying out this strategy beyond the standard workforce doing the day-to-day diplomatic work?
So the Cyber and Digital Bureau is training to have a cyber or digital officer in every post. That's the goal by the end of next year, if I remember correctly. And so those people will be on the ground to help implement that and engage with local governments and respond to their requests and help coordination there.
Are those new billets for state, and are they funded by Congress?
They're not new billets, they're people being trained. And so we're expanding the training that is happening for people as a cyber or digital officer.
So by the end of this year, a couple of hundred people or more, 250 people maybe, will have essentially a new job in place of what they've been doing at these different missions.
Yeah, they're going to be trained as cyber and digital officers, and so they'll be able to engage with the local governments and coordinate digital and cyber policy, on the ground and in their countries.
And there's a lot they need to know because there's the technology stack component, the technical knowledge, and also the knowledge of the infrastructure required. I mean, you have to know what's in a cable and so on, and it gets complicated. But then there's a lot of policy and cybersecurity doctrine to inculcate. That seems like a tall training order.
It is, but I think it also reflects one of the secretary's goals for the modernization of the department is that everybody should have some knowledge of and ability to deal with these issues. I mean, Ambassador Fick likes to point out that, nobody throws their hands up and says, well, I don't know anything about human rights or I don't know anything about China. And so that's not appropriate for technology either, right? We shouldn't be able to say, oh, I just don't know anything about tech.
Sure.
And so that's the goal, is to provide people, you don't have to be able to code and you don't have to be able to, describe spooky entanglement at a distance for quantum, but you should at least have some, basic knowledge and be able to understand the technological landscape.
And just briefly, what is your background that you bring to this?
I'm a political scientist, actually. I came outside of the department. I was at the Council on Foreign Relations, where I was writing primarily about cyber and technology strategy, which I've been doing for about 20 years.
Adam Siegel is Senior Advisor to the Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy at the State Department. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me on again.
We'll post this interview along with a link to the strategy itself at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.